Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello, and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this week we are talking with award-winning author Amanda Jayatissa. She is the author of My Sweet Girl, which won the International Thriller Writers Award for Best First Novel, and also the author of You're Invited. She grew up in Sri Lanka, and she currently lives in Portugal with her husband and, as I understand it, two very spoiled huskies. That's awesome. Love dogs, and I especially love huskies. That's amazing. But today, Amanda is here to talk with us about her latest book, Island Witch, which is inspired by Sri Lankan folklore. And for me, and I know it's been written about as well, it harkens back a little bit to some horror classics like Carrie and possibly The Exorcist. And so I'm excited to dive in. So welcome to the show, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Rick. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Oh, yay. Well, before we get into the specifics of Island Witch, though, I'd love to know a little bit about you. So I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I think like most writers, I've always been an avid reader. I grew up in Sri Lanka, where I guess a lot of the books that I had access to growing up were sort of mysteries books like Enid Blyton, the famous Five Secret Seven series were a really big thing. So that sort of started me off reading books that had, something to solve. And yeah, my love of reading grew from that, and writing just seemed like the next logical step, really. So yeah, I've been writing for as long as I can probably remember, although none of it is worth reading, I would say. And yeah, that got me started into thinking I could, venture out and write my first novel, and now here I am.
Well, did I understand that you were the first Sri Lankan woman to secure an international book contract? Is that correct?
Yeah, like from who was living in Sri Lanka. Yeah, I think so.
I am absolutely in love with that fact. So congratulations and yay you. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
So knowing that, can you talk a little bit about how maybe that impacted your work or did it have an impact? Maybe it didn't, but I'm just kind of curious.
I've always just really loved the genre. I've loved thrillers, I've loved suspense, I've loved anything that was spooky. Just growing up, I was one of those, kind of strange kids that, would watch. I remember I watched The Poltergeist with my elder cousin, and she was freaking out, and I was just giggling through the whole thing. I would have been maybe like 7 or 8, and just always had a lot of good fun watching movies and reading this type of thing. I think I read a lot of R.L. Stein books growing up as well. Goosebumps series was a major favorite. And then, of course, there was like the Fear Street books as I got a little older. And then I started reading Stephen King way too young. I remember reading it when I was like maybe 11 or 12, and being too afraid to sleep, and just like loving that feeling of being a little afraid, being kind of off kilter. And I've been sort of chasing that kind of feeling, I think, ever since.
I tend to agree with that. I think I was 12 when I read my first Stephen King novel. It was Cujo,
Oh,
and I still love dogs to this day, so it didn't traumatize me that badly. But I do remember being terrified of cars. I was like, "Do not leave me in the car. I can't stay in the car." So. It's interesting. I'm wondering, just given sort of the premise of Island Witch, I'm curious if you could, this is a random question I have. If you could time travel to any era for a day, where would you go, or when would you go rather, and what would you do while you were there?
It's really tough. I actually have a lot of thoughts on this sort of idea of time travel, and the way we tend to sort of like romanticize the past. I mean, I'm a brown woman. If I were to time travel now, like things are only going to get worse for me. So, it depends. Of course, I'd love to have been, I think, in Sri Lanka in sort of perhaps even the time that Island Witch was set, just because I think it's such an interesting time, and it would have been really cool to be someone sort of watching it, but from a removed sense. I don't think I would like to be actively involved in society at the time, just because I mean, even
Back here
researching
watching.
because like even researching this book, it was really difficult because there is nothing, no voice given to women from that time period. Certainly not Sinhalese. I mean, unless you were at the time British, or you were sort of upper class Sinhalese and male, you were kind of just in the background, which is kind of what inspired me to tell this story as well. I was like, we need something that is told from a different perspective. So yeah, sorry, that's a very loaded answer for what would have been a really fun question. All the time.
No,
But
no, it's totally.
yeah, but I do think we have this tendency to almost like romanticize the past, whereas I feel like a lot of people, especially from minorities, didn't really have much of a voice then. It wouldn't be much fun for me to go back and have to, fight to have myself heard. I would probably be killed off or be called a witch and or something. So
I can kind of relate to that as a gay man. I do not know that I would want to go back in time. But going forward in time would be something I'd like to see. I'd like to see 50 years from now or 100 years from now,
yeah,
and just to
I'm
see
all
where
about
we
the
are.
future.
So yes, exactly. So. All right. Well, you know what? Let's just dive in and talk about this amazing book of yours, Island Witch. Just because what you've said and how you've answered that question is a perfect segue for me. There's just you've touched on so many things I really want to talk about. But first, I'm going to step back a little bit because I want to bring up a quote from R.L. Stein. And you said that you used to read a lot of R.L. Stein, and you got this amazing quote from R.L. Stein. And it's his quote was, "Every once in a while, a book comes along that drops you into another world and it takes you to places that you could never imagine." And this is that book. And I actually would agree with that, and especially in regards to time travel and going back to a time and a place that some readers may not be familiar with, but yet there's so many aspects of the story that I could relate to, right? And so I was, what was it like to get that quote from R.L. Stein? How did that make you feel, knowing that you
Oh
used to
man,
read
like
him as a.
yeah. Firstly, like let me start off by saying he's just such an amazing, amazing person, right? They say, like, there's all this talk about like you should never meet your heroes, you're always disappointed. But I actually had the amazing honor of meeting him at Thriller Fest in New York a couple of years ago. And he was just the most gracious, kind man. I went up to him at the end of one of his panels, and I was just blabbing, as I'm sure you will see during the course of our chat. I tend to just sort of blabber on, and I went and told him this very incoherent story about how I grew up reading his books, and how my best friend and I used to cut class and go hide out, on the playground, and try and read his books, or hide out in the library and read his books. And he just sort of looked at me, and he was so nice. I wasn't making any sense, I'm sure, but he was so, so lovely. And then I didn't think he would remember me when I reached out to him about a year later. And I was like, hey, I absolutely adored you. I don't know if you remember me, but would you like to read my book? And he agreed. And I just thought, okay, him acknowledging my message was enough. I was like, okay, I've met him. He's nice. He responded to me. He was very kind. That's it. And then, very soon after, like a few weeks afterwards, he sent me a message, and he sent me this quote. And oh, I'm sure you can imagine. I was feeling all the feelings, right? I was crying, I was laughing. As a kid, you read these books, and like you put these writers, you're in such awe of them. And just for them to even acknowledge you, like, let alone read what you've written. I mean, I'm a writer largely because of him. And to have him blurb my book, oh, dream come true. Like, I mean, yeah.
I love this so much. I absolutely do. It's really, really great. And congratulations. So, can you give us just a sort of a brief overview into the world of Island Witch and maybe give us a little bit of inspiration at what led you to craft this amazing story about Amara?
Sure. So it's set in the 1880s in British colonial Ceylon. It takes place in a coastal village called Mathura, which is on the southern coast in Sri Lanka. And the story centers around Amara, who is the 18-year-old daughter of the local demon priest. We have a name for it for that profession in Sri Lanka. It's called a kapua or a katadia. They usually handle exorcisms or blessings and dealing with things that are more in the spirit realm. And Amara has been recently started to be bullied because there's an ideological shift happening in the island at this time, with the British rulers coming in and bringing in their new ideas of Christianity and this word witch, which is very new to society at the time. And yeah, there have been a series of attacks plaguing the men in their village. And soon suspicion falls on Amara's father because of the nature of his work. But Amara is, of course, convinced that he's innocent and, trying to prove his innocence. But she's also having these strange dreams that seem to be predicting the attacks. And she has this feeling that all of this is somehow tied in to this time she woke up dazed and confused to the sounds of her mother screaming, "No one can find out about this." It's a story that deals with a lot of themes that I am interested in and like close to my heart, feminist rage, post-colonial or colonial identity, just a coming of age and like this loss of innocence. But also actually when I wrote this, I envisioned this as almost an origin tale of Sri Lanka's most famous ghost, Mohini, even though the name isn't implicitly mentioned in the book. Mohini is Sri Lanka's quintessential woman in white, right? She is usually spotted. I always say, are you even Sri Lankan if you haven't seen or know someone who's seen Mohini? Because it's such a popular ghost story. She's a woman in white. She stands by the side of the road holding a baby, and she either kills or haunts or drives insane whoever stops to help her. The story varies. But it was always very interesting to me that we knew this about Mohini, but we didn't really know anything else about her. She was just this entity that was a part of, these stories that we'd whisper around the candle when we're trying to scare each other. That was it. No one knew where she came from. No one knew anything else about her. I feel much like a lot of women who are vilified in history. We just know them as the bad guys and we don't really care to know much more about them, which really got me thinking about, how I could frame all of these thoughts and ideas that I had and these way these stories were told growing up. And now looking at it from a slightly different lens, how do I feel about it? And that's how the idea of Island Witch came about.
I love it. And to your mention about the lady in white, I was born and raised in the South here in the United States, and we have a version of that story as well, a
Yeah.
woman in white. And I also have a Sri Lankan friend, and we would share these stories back and say, "Oh my God, I have the same story." And we would do these great sort of like ghost stories that we would kick
Yeah.
back and forth from time to time. And it's also similar to like I think in Hispanic or Mexican folklore,
Yeah,
this La
La Llorona.
Llorona. Yep.
Yeah.
So for sure. So it is definitely a theme, and I love what you've done with it, and for sure. And and touching on that, is that there's actually another quote. I wanted to talk about the R.L. Stein quote, but there's another quote that I really loved, and it's by Isabel Cañas. Cañas, yes. And her quote is, "It's a fierce exploration of a woman's rage and two kinds of demons: the ones that thrive in the darkness of the jungle, and also those that lurk under the skin of people that you thought you could trust." And
Mhm.
I just think that is so spot on for what you've done here, because I feel I don't want to give too much away. I'm going to be careful and try not to be spoilery, but Amara confronts some very horrifying moments head on, right? And I'm just in awe of how you navigated that with her character through some tough subject matters. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you chose to craft her journey, and again, without giving too much away, right? And maybe why these themes hold such great significance, why they're important to talk about.
Sure. Yeah, I love that because I think when I was writing the book, a question that I asked myself a lot of the time is, so there are a lot of scary elements in the book, right? There are demons, there are like we call them yaku, there are curses, we call them hunyang. There are the book opens with a young girl who's being possessed. There's a lot of scary things that are happening there. But a question I asked myself often when I was writing the book is like, what is truly scary, right? Is it the
Yeah.
demons, or is it this lack of control of your life? Is it, things happening around you that impact you, but you really just don't have the power? Is it the fear of not being believed? Is it the fear of not being heard? Is it the fear of the inability to protect those around you simply because of who you are or the color of your skin? Like, what is really scary here? And I think that's why, for people reading the book now and saying, oh yeah, I can relate to this, like, the truth is that fear of not having control, of not being believed, of not being heard, not having a voice, those are pretty universal fears that I think many of us carry with us, even to this day, right? It's a pretty prevalent thing, I think. And Amara is very much the underdog in this story, right? She's being othered simply because of who she is. And I feel on some level, many of us can relate to that. The specific circumstances might have changed, but the underlying feelings are still very much the same. I mean, I think we see it very much to this day about especially the treatment of women, and how even to this day, I feel that moral ideologies or religious superiorities play such a big part in the way people are treated.
I totally agree. And that was one of my next questions was you chose to tell this story and put it in 19th century Sri Lanka. And it's based on, obviously, we talked about the folklore. And you also take up the concept of bullying and sort of how she experiences this bullying. And again, I don't think it's a spoiler because it's demonstrated very early on, but she experiences this bullying not only from the community and the people around her, but also from her family to a degree as well,
Mhm.
and her relatives, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and it's so relevant to that time period, and like you said, not being heard and being female, that not being taken seriously for who she is. And
Mhm.
I absolutely really kind of liked how, while it wasn't always direct or blatant, she kind of chose to stand up, and she truly found her feet, I guess, if you will. And I
Mhm.
wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the, what it was like shaping that direction or that development with Amara and
Yeah.
that
Amara
journey.
was so, for me, it was so interesting because I think she's the first character that I've written like this, where she starts off as sort of so innocent and naive, and she is almost unassuming in the way that she's approaching things, and the way she's trusting people, and the way she's then hurt by the treatment she's receiving from her friends and from her family, and how she slowly starts then to try to find her voice, or kind of finding out where her limits lie also, because there is that doubt, right? She is essentially caught as she's growing up. So she's anyway at that time in her life where she's growing up, she's questioning, okay, the morals that I've been brought up with, is that what I truly believe in, or is that something that just my family has told me to believe in? There are these new ideas coming into place. And her growing up is almost happening as there's this shift in society in Sri Lanka at the same time, right? So there's all this change happening within her and around her as well. So for me, that was a really interesting sort of way of positioning her character. And of course, I did want her. I knew at the end, when I started writing this story, I always tend to write with the end in sight, right? Like, I knew where it was going to end up, and I knew how she was going to get there. And I knew that she had to have her heart broken for her to really realize her true self, or to come to her true power, really. And I'm trying to do this without spoilers.
Uh,
Yeah, but it
I
was
feel I
so
feel your struggle here because I'm like, there's so many things I want to say, but I'm like, I can't say it because I don't want to spoil it.
yeah. So yeah, it was like the push pull of it was just an internal struggle as well as the external struggles. And I think for me, that was why her character was so interesting for me to work on and to write.
Well, I also love how, and you just touched on this, the time period. And if you, I wonder if you could talk a little about the theme of colonization, and particularly, especially for me, having grown up in the South, we have our own relationships with religion, I guess, if you will. And I was particularly moved by one comment, and this is a little later in the book. So if you feel like it's a spoiler, say so, and I'll bleep it out. But Mara actually makes a statement to her friend. You've seen firsthand what the churches have done to my family. We've gone from being a village necessity to being shunned by everyone. And it's just such a powerful statement that just really, for me, summarizes all of that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that theme in the book and its connection to the story itself.
Sure. It was a really interesting balance for me, I think, writing about religion, because so much of it, I mean, I grew up in Sri Lanka, right? So there is sort of the religious aspects of religion and the cultural aspects of religion as well, right? And so Sri Lanka is predominantly a Buddhist country. I was raised in a Christian household, but of course, so much of Buddhism and the way Sri Lanka it's shaped the society of Sri Lanka. It's more cultural, I feel, than anything else. At its core, Sri Lankans were very superstitious. You know, we believe in a lot of things. That is, I think, a very cultural sort of thing. And talking about religion was interesting because I feel it gave us a lens to think about not just religion in terms of spiritual beliefs, but religion in terms of just society and like the entire social fabric and like, again, the shift of that, right? It's kind of important to remember that it's not just faith in God that made people shun Amara. It is the political and like socio-economic changes that the British brought into Sri Lanka. That was the true impact. And religion was mostly just used as a tool to get people to stay in line or not, which is the interesting thing, I think, also that's reflected in Amara's friendship with Neha, her childhood friend who she grew up with, who has, suddenly started embracing this new religion. And Amara feels very let down by this. And it's an interesting conflict because it also brings in, like, is it faith or is it the social construct of religion that Amara's disappointed about? Or in her friend and her friend's new views. So it's not even something that's a right or wrong. It is just shift and change. And shift and change is never easy, right? Especially not when groups of people are marginalized because of it. And it's sad that I think religion has been used this way because I don't think that was any religion's intention really at its primary core, but like that is the way, sadly, it has been used by people to wield power and have control over other groups of people. So I guess that's the sad reality of it.
I agree. And again, so many parallels in different sectors and different communities, but growing up in
Mhm.
the South, I can relate to how religion was used to control you
Yeah.
and to sort of make you behave, and they do that through fear. And it's very interesting. It was great to read about and done in a way that didn't feel preachy. It didn't feel like you were taking one side or the other. It just felt you were just put it out there and let the
Oh,
reader sort
thank
of
you.
take away with it to what they will. And it's fantastic. I loved it.
Thanks.
So
Thanks. I think when I talk about the book, it sounds a lot heavier than it actually is because like my book approach was like scare them first. But yeah, no, it's definitely these are underlying themes, but I think just things for people to think about, perhaps.
for sure. So without giving too much away, I wonder if you can point to a very pivotal moment or a scene in the book that readers should look forward to. For me, I have mine, and it is a it is a it is it, it's not a heavy moment or whatever, but it is a moment that spoke to an inner fear that I have. It's when she climbs into a hollowed out tree trunk. And in my mind, I'm like, I don't want to know what's in here right now. So that's what I'm thinking about while there's all this other stuff happening. And I'm like, what is in there with her right now? That for me was just the chills down your spine moment. I mean, there were quite a few, but that was probably the most intimate for me. So.
I think, of course, like, so my favorite bit was probably the last like 20% of the book. Like for me,
Yes.
that was my like woohoo, come home moment. And I had a lot of fun writing it. But I think a scene that I had so much fun writing was a scene that happens at the hut of the old lady with the site. And without going into spoilers, I think I drew a lot of inspiration from a story that one of my friends told me, that he claimed his friend experienced something very, very similar to what happened in that hut. And I remember when he told me the story, or he told us the story, we were in this very, like this little cabin out in the mountains, and it was just us for miles around. I remember him telling me the story, and I remember feeling like, oh, I got the heebie-jeebies. I'm like, I wonder how I can use this. And then I took that and I kind of changed around quite a few elements. And yeah, that was the scene in the hut that you have to read the book to find out more about.
I love that moment too. It's also great. I mean, like I said, there's so many great moments, but the hollowed out tree trunk moment was the one that it got me back here. I was like, what is inside here? Of all the characters in the book, is there a specific character that you felt a strong connection to, whether that's positive or negative or what? I personally love Amara, and I love where she ends up in the story. And I love what you did with that. Like, I want the sequel to this. I really, really do. But I also conversely hated Daphne so much. So
Oh,
go. What is there a character that you specifically had a strong connection to one way or the other?
oh, well,
And
it's really interesting
and
because I think,
I'll clarify. Sorry, I didn't hate Daphne in how you wrote her. I just hated like
uh,
her
no, no,
personality.
sure, of course. That's what you want to hear as a writer. Like, I hated that character so much. Like, oh, thank you.
You did your job in writing her how she was supposed to be. It worked because I just was like, I despise this. I despise this person.
Let me see. I think it's very interesting because I feel that most characters when I write, I don't want to say all of them because I think there was like maybe one or two characters in this book that were like just truly terrible, terrible all around. But I like to say that a lot of my characters at least have a little bit of like I need to be able to relate to every character at least on some level. I need to know why they're doing what they're doing, whether it comes from a place of insecurity, whether it comes from a place of entitlement or fear or anger, like whatever it is, I have to know where that core emotion that even that makes them a terrible person, I need to know where that comes from. So I think in that sense, I definitely have tend to have a connection with almost, I would say, all the characters. The character that I had a lot of, and I think, of course, I love Amara. I absolutely love Amara. She's my main character. I feel very protective of her almost. But the character that I think I had a lot of, I want to say fun writing, but also that I think I took a lot of care into crafting was Amara's mother. Because I feel like she was such a nuanced character in that, like, of course, she's made mistakes. Does that come from her own relationship with her own mother? And I love that I brought sort of was able to bring the grandparents into the story as well. And it's just, for me, she's the character that had the most nuance, I think, of all the characters in the book, where sometimes you're wondering, okay, is she operating out of love for her daughter? Is she operating out of like social construct and what was expected of her? Was she operating out of almost a type of vengefulness for things that have happened to her in the past? It's so cyclical almost what was happening here. And yeah, So without giving anything away, for me, that was one of the most interesting characters to craft for sure.
I was going to say too, Amma, the mother, was just as far as levels go with the character, she had so much going on, and it's exactly what you said. In the beginning, I was like, "Where's this coming from?" And
Mhm.
is this an misguided and maybe sort of overzealous attempt at maternalism, right? And she's trying to, protect her child, and then as her story progresses, you learn again. I won't get into spoilers with that as well, but you learn all these different things, and she was a very intricate character, and I loved that. Thought it was really great. Well done, well done. So I want to talk a little bit about symbolism, metaphors in the story, but I don't want to give away too much. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, here's the thing. I feel like horror is sort of an allegory for life, right? Sometimes it's a mirror for things that we experience and maybe things that we can't explain, and it's just a way of getting feelings out. I'm just kind of curious, is there symbolism in the story? Does it represent something for you, or is there a message or an experience that you hope that your readers will take away from Island Witch?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, it is just an interesting examination of the way women are treated, right? So I always joke, I say when I was doing research for this book, one of the books that I referred to a lot was a book published in the 1860s. It was on demonology and witchcraft in Ceylon that really outlined a lot of these rituals and practices. And reading that and then speaking to present day kapuas and katadiyas, which I did when I was writing this book, it was so interesting to me because so little had changed from the 1860s to now in the way we practice these rituals, right? Little has also changed in the way we treat women. So, certain things that Amara faces, for example, the fact that she's got darker skin and her mom's like giving her all these potions to like rub on herself and make herself lighter, like that is something that's so prevalent even in present day Sri Lanka. The fact that women are often othered and their opinions are not taken seriously. Of course, there's a shift on paper, but realistically, of course, like a lot of these issues still exist today, even when it comes to social hierarchy and classism, which you see a little bit in the book, because Amara's mother came from a sort of a wealthier family, and then of course Amara's father was from for someone's lower down the ranks, so to speak. We see a lot of classism today as well. So it's interesting because even though like a lot of the big parts of society have changed and we like to consider ourselves very modern, at our core, a lot of these issues still exist. And, like what I hope is it again comes back to sort of my love of Mohini and like wondering where her story sprang from. I really hope it leaves people questioning, like the next time you hear a story about a really terrible woman, maybe she's a ghost, maybe she's a queen who, there are so many of those like evil queens in history, maybe, these women that we just very casually have labeled as, demonic or witches or bad. I'd invite everyone to stop a little and think, where does that come from? Why are we so comfortable not questioning why a woman is so hated, why she's so vilified, why she's, made to be the villain? And maybe there's a side of things that, we might not be seeing.
That is absolutely the best answer I could have ever hoped for.
You're too
It's just
kind.
it really is just so insightful and so true and so important, I think. But I have one last question, and I know we've talked forever here. So but I have one last question for you, because you've talked about it, you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I'm fascinated by the research that you put into this book. Can you just talk a little bit more about some of the research that you've done to tell this story? And I just am enthralled by the idea that all of these religious practices you just mentioned haven't changed that much, in all these years. So, but I'll stop talking. You talk.
No, it's so true. We're such a superstitious culture. I think like before you move into a house, you would call a kapua a lot of the time, and they would come and cut limes and do a blessing for your house. Before you lay your foundation stone, there would be some sort of ceremony to drive away any bad spirits. I haven't got mine yet because I haven't got my stuff shipped over from my old house, but in Sri Lanka, we hang these little demon masks in our house because we have this idea that these bad spirits will scare away any worse spirit. So there's so much of that remains unchanged, and it was so interesting for me. I was lucky enough to get my hands on a lot of these older books, which, by the way, I made sure, and I like to just put it out there that I did not read aloud from any of these books because I have watched The Mummy, and I know that no good comes from reading from any of these books on like witchcraft and spells and things like that. But it did have so much fun, finding all of this stuff. But I actually freaked myself out quite a few times. I'm not gonna lie, hung a little rosary on above my computer at one point because I was like, I need to keep all the bad spirits away. But yeah, and then I was also very lucky that one of my very good friends is, quite the history buff, and she found this book. I think she was saying that had been in her family for a very, very long time. It was probably a few hundred years old, and it outlined a lot again of like these ceremonial practices and like just traditional practices that happened in Ceylon around that period of time. So I got very, very lucky, and of course, without the help of my friends who I would, ask for like, do you have an officer's uniform, like a British soldier's uniform who would have been stationed in Mathura at this time, and who came through for me with these like images, which was wild. But yeah, the research part of it was really cool. I also went to Mathura. I've been to Mathura many times, but I actually spent quite a bit of time in Mathura, and I tried to walk the routes that I knew Amara would walk in the
Love that.
story. So I visited the Star Fort, just the Gulf Fort in general. I visited a few old chapels that still exist on the fort. The priests were lovely and were very generous with sort of the information they were able to give me. And it's just, I really dove headfirst into writing this book, and I just enjoyed it so much.
It shows. It definitely shows in the words and the work. It's fantastic. One last question about research, real quick. How long was that research period for you? How long did you spend researching this? Just with
Oh, well, it's interesting because a lot of the things I think I knew. So the process for this was very straight. It was different from my normal books. Whereas I wrote this outline actually many years ago, probably back in I want to say 2017 or 2018. And I wrote this outline and I put it away. And something about me didn't feel like I was ready to tell this story. And I'm glad I held off really, because I think where we ended up was very different from, the initial sort of tone and the impact that I was hoping for when I wrote that outline. And yeah, and then when I was writing when I was speaking to my editor about, what would come next, I actually was working on a completely different book. I had it outlined and written a few chapters, and I was chatting to her about it. And just on a whim, because I had just found this outline suddenly many years later, maybe a week before we had this chat. And I was like, oh, you know what? I just found this thing, and it's called Island Witch, and I don't know if you'd be interested. And she just stopped and she smiled and she's like, tell me more. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I see what's happening here. And
I
yeah, and
totally would have done the same thing. I'd be like, just I don't want to hear anything else. Let's talk Island Witch.
yeah, it was so funny. I was not expecting, I guess, her to be as interested as she was, and I was very excited to hear that of course, like she wanted to hear more about it. I said, let me write you a few chapters, and we'll see, because it is a little different. Not a little, it's very different from my other books, which are very contemporary, set in present day. Don't have don't have supernatural elements in it really. Yeah, more in the thriller suspense space. So it was different, and I was very nervous. And so to answer your question, I immediately sort of dove into trying to get my hands on as many books as possible. It took quite a while. Things slowed down a little bit because there was a political and economic crisis that was happening in Sri Lanka at the time. So we were also dealing with like these rolling blackout, like these power cuts that would happen sometimes for 8 hours a day. And I'd be like typing and praying my
Wow.
laptop battery wouldn't die. And there was a whole lot. So There's a lot of people are like, oh, there's a lot of rage in this book. I was like, yes, I was feeling a lot of rage as I wrote it, for sure. I was definitely very angry and at the time of writing, and it shows. So my research was interrupted, but I did get to go down and spend a little bit of time in about a week in Mathura, where I did a lot of research and things like that. So sourcing the old books took a lot longer than I hoped for, and it was definitely not a linear process. There were when I was drafting the book, there were like paragraphs. It was like insert description here, or verify whether this is historically accurate. There was a lot of that, and then I kept going back and trying to fill those gaps.
That's fantastic. All right. I will just be mindful of our time here. I'm just going to switch gears a little bit. I know you probably get this question a lot. Everybody asks it, but I love it because it helps me fill up my bookshelves. So I'm kind of curious if there are any authors and it doesn't have to be horror. It can be any genre that is sort of caught your attention right now or filling the shelves of your bookshelf.
Sure. So I am a huge fan. You've already mentioned Isabel Cañas, so I'm assuming you're familiar with her writing. The Vampires of El Norte
El
was
Norte. Yep.
wonderful. Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead was also really good. If you like these elements of weaving folklore and these like lush sort of jungle forest imagery in, and at its heart there being sort of this mystery to solve, I think Ashley Winstead hits those notes really, really well. I'm a big fan of all her books, but I think Midnight is the Darkest Hour is probably my favorite.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have one for you. I'll be real quick. Just released this week. It's Dinner on Monster Island by Tanya de Rosario. And I talked to her a few weeks ago, and it's a book of essays that talks about her life growing up in Singapore. And it was such a great book and just real and emotional. And she made me cry in the
Oh,
interview.
wow.
So
Wow,
I highly
as
recommend
a
it.
writer, you're like, oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I will certainly look that up. That sounds so interesting.
Right.
And if it made you
So
cry.
yeah, there you go. So Amanda, what's next on the horizon for you? Are you working on the sequel to my favorite book now?
No, I'm afraid it's not not a sequel to Island Witch. I can't really talk much about it yet, I'm afraid, but I can promise you that there will be dead bodies and murder and
Well, I'm there. I'm absolutely
spooky.
there. All right, last bonus question real quick. This is not related to any of the books that we've talked about. This is something I ask every guest on the show. I'm going to have you write a short horror story for me using 3 random words.
Do you tell me the random words?
No,
Or
you tell me the random words. Just pick 3 random words and craft a little horror story using those 3 words.
so I pick the words and I craft the story. I feels like I'm doing a lot of work here. Oh, man. All right, we're gonna go refrigerator, cheese, dog.
Perfect.
Like the one
I'll
thing I
make it.
can think about, okay, because a horror story, a true horror story to me is like my refrigerator, realizing all the cheese is gone because my dog ate it and I don't have cheese, so I can't make myself a grilled cheese. And that is a very heartbreaking, scary time for me.
I love it. It's fantastic. So the book is called Island Witch. If you haven't heard me say it 20 times already during the interview, it's available everywhere on February 20th. And as we always like to say here at Quills and Chills, please support your local bookstore. And Amanda, how can our audience find you on social media?
It's very easy. It's just my name on everything. So Amanda Jayatissa on Instagram, Twitter, my website, Facebook. Yeah.
Perfect.
All the good stuff.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I know it's evening on Friday for you there, so I appreciate your time tonight, as it
Oh, thank
were.
you so much, Rick, for having me. This was so much fun.
Yay. All right, that's it for Quills and Chills this week. We will talk to all of you next time. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review. because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.